The Ombudswoman warns EU lawmaking lacks transparency and evidence. Putin signals retaliation over potential seizure of Russian assets in Europe. And Italy's ruling coalition presses claim to central bank's $300 billion gold reserves. Hello there, good evening and welcome to the Qnews Economic Bulletin for tonight. I'm Mark Summers. We start off with Europe, where EU Ombudswoman Teresa Anginio has accused the European Commission of fast-tracking measures on sustainability reporting, agriculture and migrant smuggling without adhering to its own standards for transparent, evidence-based lawmaking. Anginio said that the Commission failed to justify the urgency, citing an inquiry triggered by complaints from climate and human rights campaigners. She added that, taken together, these shortcomings amounted to maladministration and that principles of good lawmaking could not be compromised, even for the sake of urgency. European Central Bank policymaker Martin Kazaks has stated that it is still too early for the bank to consider another interest rate cut, warning that Eurozone inflation could yet come in higher than expected. Ahead of the December 18th meeting, the Latvian Central Bank governor argued that borrowing costs should remain unchanged for now, as underlying inflation is still well above the 2% target and risks remain on both sides. Kazaks noted that a likely delay to the EU's ETS2 system would ease inflation, but stressed that core inflation remains high. He added that while downside risks are well understood, upside risks like trade fragmentation should not be ignored.
If rates go up too much, problems.
Italy's borrowing costs have fallen to a one-year low at an auction today as investors grew confident the US Federal Reserve will cut rates in December. The Treasury raised the full planned amount of 9.5 billion euros across 3 bonds. It sold 2.75 billion euros of a 10-year bond at a yield of 3.44%, the lowest since November 2024. A 5-year bond also saw its yield drop to a 5-month low of 2.74%. The sale included 4 billion euros of a new floating rate note. The result highlights how expectations of easier global monetary policy are lowering financing costs for European governments. Still in Europe, Spain's Congress of Deputies has rejected the government's proposed 2026 spending plan, dealing a setback to efforts to restore a normal budget schedule, after the conservative PP, the far-right Vox, Catalan separatist Junts and hard-left Podemos all voted against it. It had set a non-debt spending cap of 216.2 billion euros, up 8.5% from last year. Budget Minister Maria Jesus Montero said the government will still press ahead with the 2026 budget and submit it to Parliament early next year, potentially allowing another vote on the fiscal framework in winter. She argued the new budget would provide more funding for regions and municipalities, adding that the PP must explain its opposition to these needed resources. Russia's central bank has stated that emerging market central banks are increasing their gold purchases to diversify reserves as the G7 considers using frozen Russian assets. It added that investor demand for gold is also rising amid uncertainty over global growth. The bank noted that the metal is benefiting from steady emerging market demand driven by these diversification efforts. President Vladimir Putin has announced that Russia is preparing a package of retaliatory measures in response to potential seizures of Russian assets in Europe.
Как это может отразиться на европейской валюте, ясно, что это будет иметь негативные последствия для мировой финансовой системы, потому что доверие к еврозоне резко снизится, резко упадет. А на фоне сложности в экономике, где локомотив европейской экономики, экономика Германии, уже третий год пребывает в рецессии, это, конечно, будет, мне кажется, непростым испытанием. Правительство Российской Федерации, по моему поручению, вырабатывает пакет ответных мер в случае, если это произойдет. И всем ясно, все об этом прямо говорят, что это было бы воровством чужой собственности.
President Putin. The International Monetary Fund has reached a staff-level agreement on a new 4-year, $8.2 billion program for Ukraine, replacing the $15.6 billion extended fund facility from 2023. The program aims to support macroeconomic stability and public finances amid the ongoing war, with financing gaps for 26 to 29 estimated at $136.5 billion. IMF official Gavin Gray said the program is expected to attract external support, while Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko called it proof of Ukraine's economic resilience and pledged to continue reforms. IMF noted that the program can go to the executive board once prior actions are completed and donor funding is secured. Now, joining us from London is the Dean of Business and Economics at London University, Ali Khoshed, who is with us now. Thank you for being with us here on Q News. So, given Ukraine's ongoing conflict and the economic instability, how is the IMF structuring its new $8.2 billion loan program to effectively support the country's stability and public finances?
Good afternoon to you, and good afternoon to all your listeners. Well, in fact, IMF restructuring another small loan, which is 8.2, as you mentioned, but over and above the previous ones. But this one is, they call it for macroeconomic stability. By other words, is for the small companies and the small requirements, not including any weapons or armors or weapons which they fighting the Russian. This is just a small amount to stabilize the public finances. As you know, the public finances gone dry over the last couple of years over the last 4 years because of the Ukrainian-Russian war, and that is only help a very small section of the government requirements. If you're looking at what the IMF become lending Ukraine over the last 4 years, you find they were lending over 136 billion USD, and this is a debt which is expected to be paid on the year 2029. Adding the interest, which is a normal small interest they charge in Ukraine, that will reach 163 or 164 billion USD. By other words, you're talking about economic words, the IMF will have a debt placed on Ukraine by 164 billion USD. By other words, the Ukraine cannot pay. So therefore, the country will be in debt forever to the IMF. The IMF, on the other hand, will wave the flag to to the U.S. and say, well, look, Ukraine owe me 164 billion, so therefore reducing my borrowing by that much, then America will, U.S. come and put pressure on the on Ukraine to accept the peace deal, which is then reducing this debt. On the other hand, the Trump, as you may count, he was pressuring Ukraine to accept the contract for precious metal extrication from Ukraine. Now, so far, the Ukrainian has not signed and will agree to that, but they will have to because of the debt accumulating. Now, America will, indirectly occupies or make a debt to Ukraine for reaching 164 billion plus whatever come on top of it, as you just mentioned, another 8.2 billion plus another amount which is the Americans for all the latest weapons and armament they send it to them. That means Ukraine will be in debt forever to the U.S.
I was going to ask you, Dr. Ali, are there safeguards and conditions that the IMF is imposing on Ukraine to ensure economic reforms and financial management that can sustain this financing?
Well, it's like any other lender. If you go into the bank and say, I am Mark, I want $100 because I want to buy a new car, the bank will ask you for a guarantee or asset to put aside, or to sign a piece of paper that you will be in debt for this $100 until you pay. So you become like a slave to the bank until you pay the $100. And that is exactly what America wants from Ukraine, is to put Ukraine into a debt whereby they cannot say no to whatever Trump saying it is a peace agreement. Now, I'm not going to go into the peace deal, which is America imposes in Ukraine, but within the peace agreement, within looking at it from the outside rather than the in deep on the terms and conditions, you will find that Ukraine will be in debt to US and IMF for years to come. The only way they can get out of there is to accept certain pressure and certain contracts. One of the contracts which is waiting to be signed is the extrication of the precious metals. Then at that stage, Ukraine cannot say no. Because they already put their economic in the negative by far, besides all the other debts which is on to the US and the IMF in different ways.
And are there mechanisms that the IMF has in place like to assess risks and monitor progress? And has it adapted these from its lending program with Ukraine because of the ongoing war?
Well, assessing the risk, what risk would you assess when the country in war? When the country in war and losing every day with 300 or 400 men, and the condition of the country cannot export or cannot do agriculture or manufacture anything, what safeguard they're going to have? They're going to have another political safeguard by saying, okay, I'm doing the money today, but you had to pay me later on. So later on, for 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, or whatever. So the Ukraine will be in debt to the IMF and US for years to come. I don't know how many years they're imposing, but I would guess, just rough guess, will be anything between 10 to 20 years. They will be in debt. All the outcome, all the agriculture proceeds, all the exports, that will recover the debt which is imposed on Ukraine for the next, say, 10 or 20 years. Assessing the risk, there is no way you can say to somebody broke, I'm assessing your risk. The only way you can do is get a variable guarantee or a conditional guarantee that when the situation improves, then you will pay the debt. America putting, on the other hand, putting the situation where Ukrainian have to accept the peace deal for them to start to pay the debt. And so every time the Ukrainian wanted some new weapons or a loan or economic backup of any sort, yes, we have open account, we can give you what you want. But at the same time, when they're going to pay, they're paying when later on or from their own resources. So let's go back to the precious metal contract. That's American waiving that and waiting for that to receive. At least they will save them having to pay the Russian, the Chinese, all this money for buying the precious metal.
Okay.
And
Well,
if they got it from Ukraine cheap, or in a few years to come, that will be better still.
okay. Well, let me come to Russia now. How does Russia's central bank's gold buying strategy help mitigate the impact of Western sanctions and also this potential use of frozen Russian assets?
Well, let me just go back a little history. Russia, for the last 10 to 15 years, were producing a lot of gold, and they never put their gold in the global market. They will, even when they were producing gold, they were buying gold from Russia, from China, from different places. So Russia managed over the last 15 years to accumulate quite a lot of gold. And that gold is stabilizing the Russian economy. Remember when America imposed all these conditions and get Russian out of the global economic stability, the Russian laughed and carried on. It's because they have something to rely back on, and that was the gold. The gold is in Russia is considered to be the second after China. So the first country hold the gold is U.S., as we all know. Secondly will be China. Third will be Russia. And Russia, relying on this gold to cover all its needs and all its economic future. If you're talking about the gold for Russia, now it gives them the way out from all this economic imposition the America put in them.
And coming to Putin himself, because Putin's announced retaliatory measures against potential seizures of Russian assets in Europe. What does this mean in geopolitical and economic terms?
I think Putin was laughing at the European when they say they're going to freeze the asset, because they cannot freeze the asset. The asset is there as investment of Russia in different banks or even the central banks of Europe. And the central banks, when they receive this asset, they guarantee a certain percentage have to be paid. Now, you don't collect the interest on the asset now, you accumulate it, and the accumulation will give them more interest. So the accumulation of the Russian assets in different banks make the Russian happy, because this is asset, although they are not using it now, it's frozen, but frozen the asset, but not, you cannot freeze or you cannot pay the interest. European will have a very heavy bill after the Ukraine-Russian war ends, because they will find out themselves they have to pay not just the asset, they have to pay the interest on the asset.
Okay, I'm going to have to. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to. I'm sorry, Dr. Ali. I'm going to have to interrupt. But we did get the point of your last answer there. But thank you so much, Dr. Ali Khoshed, joining us, Dean of Business and Economics at London University, joining us from London. Thank you very much indeed. Now we go to the latest developments from all over the world, and we go to Asia. So in Asia then, the Bank of Korea has held its key interest rate steady at 2.5%, citing persistent housing market pressures and heightened volatility in the foreign exchange market as the $1 exchange rate continues to rise. This marks the fourth consecutive freeze since May. The central bank also revised its growth and inflation outlook upward, projecting the economy to grow by 1% this year and 1.8% next year, up from previous forecasts of 0.9% and 1.6% respectively. Inflation projections were also raised to 2.1% for both years, from 2% to 1.9%. In North America, the U.S. Labor Department reported that new unemployment claims fell to a 7-month low last week, signaling continued low layoffs, even as the labor market struggles to create enough jobs amid economic uncertainty. Initial jobless claims dropped by 6,000 to a seasonally adjusted 216,000 for the week ending November 22nd, the lowest since April. Continuing claims, seen as a proxy for hiring, rose by 7,000 to 1.96 million for the week ending November 15th. And staying in North America, Prime Minister Mark Carney has said that Canada will sharply tighten steel import limits and roll out new support for its steel and lumber sectors in response to U.S. tariffs. Import quotas for non-FTA countries will be slashed to 20% of 2024 levels, down from 50%. FTA partners, excluding the US and Mexico, will see quotas cut to 75%. Canada will also apply a global 25% tariff on select steel derivative products and boost anti-dumping enforcement. Starting in 2026, freight rates for shipping steel and lumber between provinces will be cut by 50%, and the government will promote greater use of Canadian materials in home building. The measures aim to protect domestic industry and jobs as it faces ongoing US trade pressures. Now to Oceania. The Australian Bureau of Statistics reported that consumer inflation accelerated for the 4th consecutive month in October, prompting markets to abandon expectations of further policy easing and even consider a potential rate hike. The monthly consumer price index rose 3.8% year-on-year, its highest pace in 10 months. Core inflation, measured by the trimmed mean, increased to 3.3% from 3.2% in September. Housing costs also climbed, advancing 5.9% over the 12 months to October. Now, coffee lovers, brace yourselves. Your morning cup might soon cost more than you think. Despite hopes that US tariff cuts would bring relief, global coffee prices are still soaring. Our very own Hanny Safe explains why your favorite brew is getting pricier, straight from the experts.
Before you grab your next cup of coffee, you might want to hear this. Prices are climbing again, and the relief everyone expected? Still nowhere in sight. Even with expectations that US tariff cuts would cool things down, the relief hasn't filtered through. Global coffee prices are still sitting near historic highs. Italian roaster Elite Cafe is already bracing for another price hike in January after raising prices twice this year. Why? Because Arabica beans, the heart of premium coffee, have surged to record levels. A mix of US tariffs on Brazilian imports and weak harvests worldwide has pushed costs through the roof. Yes, prices dipped slightly after the US brought in tariff breaks for Brazil, but they're still nowhere near normal. Elite Cafe CEO Cristina Scocchia says there's only so much companies can swallow. Consumer prices don't react overnight. They lag behind commodity costs by months, even a full year. Translation: more price increases are likely across the entire coffee sector. And the long-term outlook isn't exactly comforting. The company expects raw bean prices to stabilize maybe by late 2026 at around $2.8 to $3 a pound, still much higher than the averages of recent years. Elite Cafe is sticking with Brazilian beans despite the tariff headaches. They're essential for the brand's signature blends. It's it's now planning to boost production partnerships in the US, which already makes up 20% of its business. But here's the twist. Rising prices aren't scaring coffee lovers anyway. Demand is strong, sales volumes are steady, and the global coffee market is still growing, slowly but surely. So for now, the takeaway is simple. Your next cup of coffee, it's probably going to be more expensive before it gets cheaper.
Thank you very much, Hanny. Safe there with that report on something everyone cares about, coffee. Now, we are joined, our next guest tonight on the program from Holborn by Director of the World Pensions Forum and former advisor to the World Bank, Meher Nicholas Fursley. Hello and welcome to the program. Why haven't U.S. drinking your coffee there, I can see. Why haven't U.S. tariffs, the tariff cuts, lowered global coffee prices yet, Nick?
I think it will take time, and I think we expect too much from the White House, or we blame the White House for things that are beyond its reach, even though, it's true that Trump is partly responsible to what happened being food price inflation. It's partly his fault, but not only. And we expect a lot from him. So if he stops, he had let's say an abusive, huge, and very abrupt, the key word here is abrupt. So he slapped tariffs on Brazil, the world's biggest exporter, let's say, of coffee, 45%. It's huge. He did the same, by the way, to Switzerland, the world's largest manufacturer of premium chocolate, right? And just like Brazil, I think 3 days before Brazil, he removed the very high, taxation on Switzerland, on Swiss chocolate, and he went to 45 to 10 or 15%. What I'm coming at, yes, it's abrupt. Yes, it's not very smart from the part of Trump, but it's not only his fault. There are like longer trends. One of them is climate change and the fact that in countries like Vietnam, for example, or Ethiopia, which used to be some of the world's biggest producers and exporters of coffee, flooding, lack of investment in agricultural infrastructure also explains that the yield is mediocre or low, and so supply and demand, the price rises. The same is true in Brazil. Brazil didn't invest enough in agro infrastructure, but Brazil is big and is still exporting vast quantities of coffee beans to America. Not enough. This is the supply side, but on the demand side, there's much worse. On the demand side, you have new coffee consumers. So, my father's lived and worked in New York City in the late 50s, early 60s, and he told me that there were only 5 or 6 restaurants or cafes in New York City at the time, all of them Italian, where you could have decent coffee. All the rest in America back then, in the late 50s, was filter coffee or tea or whatever. Today, tens of millions of Americans, they drink premium Italian, Brazilian-style coffee. Likewise, in India or China, coffee consumption was tiny 20, 30 years ago. Now it's huge. So on the demand side, it's exploding. And you have the same phenomenon, by the way, for olive oil, another Italian, Mediterranean staple. Now everyone in America and China and India, they want olive oil. In the middle class or upper middle class wants to have olive oil. So all that, demand is exploding, supply is not catching up because of a lack of proper investment in infrastructure in the agro business. Why didn't we invest enough in the agro industry? Because the money went elsewhere. So the money went to consumer products, fashion, tech, high tech, and we neglected the number one economic sector, which is agriculture. And adding insult to injury, very blindly, I'm a big supporter of the environment and climate finance. I'm a believer, but the way sort of, to fight climate change, the way the Europeans proceeded in the past 5-6 years, and the Brits, they proceeded blindly, and they hurt their own coffee growers. Their own, in the south of Italy, in Greece, you have a little bit of, traditional coffee makers, etc. They have made it more difficult for them to produce coffee.
Okay. Now, what people really want to know is, when can consumers realistically expect coffee prices to stabilize?
It's a good question. I'm a little cautious. So I think what Trump did last week was good. It will be good for coffee, but also, for meat, right? For meat, and like I said, olive oil, etc. So it's beyond coffee and chocolate, but it will take time because investment decisions, especially when it comes to crops, right? You plant the seeds, metaphorically, you plant the seeds and you yield, you get your hands on the final product 6 months, 9 months, 1 year later. So it is a 1 year plus cycle, not 5 days or 6 days. Likewise, the infrastructure. So, for example, in Brazil, what is missing in Brazil? They haven't invested enough in highways. The transportation network of Brazil is a disaster. So both the left in power. So today the left is in power in Brazil. Trump hates them.
Yes.
Trump constantly mocks them. But even the right was as silly as the left. They have underinvested in transportation infrastructure for the past 60 years.
Okay. Okay, well, that's given us a good unfortunately, we're just out of time. I'm glad that I'm a tea man. I'm a cup of tea man. Rather than a coffee person after that. Thank you, Nick. World Pensions Forum Director, former advisor to the World Bank, Mehan Nicholas Fursley, joining us from Holborn. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Indeed.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Now, back to our economic news. Italian Senator Lucio Malan has stated that the ruling coalition plans to push ahead with a claim that the central bank's $300 billion in gold reserves legally belong to the state, despite concerns the move could violate EU rules. He argued the initiative is meant to ensure the reserves cannot be misused, stressing that even the Bank of Italy has limits on how it can handle the gold. Milan denied any plan to sell the reserves, saying the goal is to prevent the possibility of an unapproved sale without offering further details. In response, the Bank of Italy says the gold can be used as collateral for loans or, as a last resort, sold to buy euros to support the currency. And that brings us to the end of our economic bulletin, but here's a recap of the main economic headlines tonight. Ombudswoman warns EU lawmaking lacks transparency and evidence. Putin signals retaliation over potential seizure of Russian assets in Europe. And Italy's ruling coalition presses claim to central bank's $300 billion gold reserves. And that's tonight's Economic Bulletin. We'll be back here the same time tomorrow with more economic news for you. In the meantime, you can join us 24 hours a day at Qnews EGY on our social media platforms. We've got more coming up next, so stay with us here on Q News. I'm going for a cup of tea. Have a lovely night.